The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Blue Ridge Mountain overlook as Staff Sergeant James Cooper guided his black Ford F-150 into the empty parking area. The truck's tires crunched against the gravel, breaking the peaceful mountain silence. It was a beautiful October evening, with the kind of clear sky that made the mountains look like they went on forever. James had been coming to this spot for the past 3 years, ever since he'd been stationed at Fort Bragg. Today wasn't just any regular visit, though. It was exactly 5 years since he'd lost his best friend, Mark Wilson, during their last deployment in Afghanistan. The memory of that day still felt fresh in his mind, like an old wound that never quite healed right. The 34-year-old Special Forces veteran pulled up to his usual spot, the one with the best view of the valley below. He switched off the engine but left the key in the ignition, letting the radio play quietly in the background. Some country song about hometown memories filled the cab of his truck, mixing with the sound of wind rustling through the autumn leaves. James reached over to the passenger seat and picked up the worn photograph he brought with him. It showed two soldiers, arms around each other's shoulders, standing in front of a helicopter in Afghanistan. Both were covered in dust, but their smiles were bright and genuine. That photo had been taken just 3 days before the ambush that took Mark's life. The evening air was getting cooler as James stepped out of his truck. He was still in his army workout clothes, gray t-shirt with Army printed across the chest and black shorts, having come straight from the base after finishing his training session with the new recruits. His dog tags clinked softly against his chest as he walked to the stone wall that marked the edge of the overlook. Looking out at the spectacular view, James couldn't help but think about how different things were now. He'd made it through 4 deployments, earned 2 Purple Hearts, and trained countless soldiers. But days like today always brought him back to that moment 5 years ago, when a routine patrol turned into a firefight that changed everything. He pulled his phone from his pocket and checked the time. 6:45 p.m. The sun would be setting in about an hour. James had planned it this way, wanting to be here as day turned to night. It was during sunset that he and Mark used to talk about their plans for the future, sitting on their base in Afghanistan, dreaming about what they'd do when they got home. The overlook was peaceful at this hour. Most tourists had already left, heading back to their hotels or homes for dinner. The only sounds were the gentle whisper of the wind and the occasional call of a hawk soaring overhead. James liked it better this way, quiet and empty. It gave him space to think, to remember, and sometimes to talk to Mark, even though he knew his friend couldn't hear him. He walked back to his truck and grabbed the thermos of coffee he brought along. It was a habit he'd picked up in the military, always having coffee ready, no matter the time of day. The warm liquid helped fight off the growing chill in the mountain air. As he took a sip, his eyes caught the reflection of his military bumper sticker in the truck's tailgate, Special Forces, De Oppresso Liber. James settled onto the hood of his truck, his back against the windshield, legs stretched out in front of him. From here, he had a perfect view of both the valley below and the winding mountain road that led up to the overlook. Years of military training had taught him to always be aware of his surroundings, even in moments of peace. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant shades of orange and purple, reminding him of those Afghan sunsets he and Mark used to watch together. James couldn't know that this peaceful moment was about to be shattered, or that his training would soon be put to use in a way he never expected at this quiet mountain overlook. The peaceful mountain silence was suddenly broken by the loud rumble of motorcycle engines. James's eyes snapped open, his military instincts instantly alert. 3 bikes appeared around the bend, their engines echoing off the mountain walls. They were Harley-Davidsons, all painted black with chrome details that caught the fading sunlight. The riders pulled into the overlook's parking area, their bikes arranged in a loose triangle formation. James watched them carefully through half-closed eyes, his body remaining still but his mind already analyzing the situation. His years of Special Forces training had taught him to observe first, react later. The lead biker was a big man, probably around 250 pounds, with a scraggly gray beard that reached his chest. He wore a black leather vest covered in patches, some with symbols James recognized from local troublemaker groups. The man's arms were covered in faded tattoos, and a bandana with skull patterns was tied around his head. To his right was a younger guy, probably in his mid-20s, skinny and nervous-looking with a fresh snake tattoo on his neck. The third rider was medium-built, with a shaved head and a face that showed signs of too many fights and too much drinking. All three had the same patch on their vests, Mountain Raiders MC. James had heard about this group from local police at Fort Bragg. They weren't a real motorcycle club, just a bunch of wannabes who liked to cause trouble for tourists and locals alike. They'd been involved in several incidents at scenic spots like this one, usually targeting people they thought wouldn't fight back. The leader killed his engine and nudged the younger guy, pointing at James's truck. The military sticker on the bumper had caught his attention. A cruel smile spread across his face as he whispered something to his companions, causing them to laugh. James could read their body language clearly. They were looking for entertainment, and they thought they'd found an easy target. Well, what do we have here? The leader called out, his voice rough from years of cigarettes. Looks like we got ourselves a soldier boy enjoying the view. He dismounted his bike with surprising agility for his size, his boots crunching on the gravel. James remained motionless on his truck's hood, but his muscles tensed slightly. He counted weapons, 2 visible hunting knives, brass knuckles on the young one's belt, and probably more hidden. Nothing he hadn't dealt with before in combat training. The 3 bikers spread out, unconsciously using a flanking maneuver that made James almost smile. They were trying to look tactical, but their positioning was amateur at best. The leader took center, while his companions moved to either side, attempting to look threatening. "Hey, soldier boy, I'm talking to you," the leader shouted, his voice carrying an edge of anger at being ignored. "Don't they teach you military types any manners?" The younger biker snickered, trying too hard to impress his leader. James slowly sat up, his movements deliberate and controlled. He took another sip of coffee from his thermos, using the moment to assess distances and angles. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows that could work to his advantage if things went bad. The bald biker spat on the ground near James's truck. "Maybe he thinks he's too good to talk to us," he growled, his hands clenching into fists. The young one reached for his brass knuckles, trying to look tough, but his hands were shaking slightly. "You picked a bad day to come up here alone, soldier," the leader said, taking another step forward. His confidence grew with each step, misreading James's calm demeanor as fear. "We don't like your kind around here. Military thinks they're better than everyone else." James finally turned his head to look directly at them. His eyes were cold and focused, the kind of look that comes from years of real combat experience. For a brief moment, the young biker's swagger faltered. Something in that steady gaze made him realize they might have made a mistake. The peaceful evening had transformed into a powder keg, ready to explode. As the last rays of sunlight painted the sky crimson, James knew this confrontation was about to escalate. His mind was already running through scenarios, planning moves and counter-moves, just as he'd been trained to do in far more dangerous situations than this. The leader of the bikers took another step forward, his boots scraping against the gravel. James noticed how the man shifted his weight. He was trying to look intimidating, but his stance revealed he had no real fighting training. 5 years in special forces had taught James to read people like open books. "Last chance, soldier boy," the leader growled, cracking his knuckles. "You can either get off that truck and apologize for disrespecting us, or things are gonna get real unpleasant." Behind him, the young biker with the snake tattoo was bouncing on his toes, excited by the prospect of violence but clearly inexperienced. James took one last sip of his coffee, then carefully screwed the lid back on his thermos. The photo of him and Mark was still sitting on the truck's hood. He picked it up and gently placed it inside his truck through the open window. Some things were too precious to risk in a fight. "Gentlemen," James finally spoke, his voice calm and measured. "I came here to remember a friend. I'm not looking for trouble." His words carried the weight of someone who had seen real combat, real violence, not the kind these men played at. The bald biker laughed, a harsh sound that echoed off the mountain walls. "Well, ain't that too bad? 'Cause trouble just found you." He pulled out a switchblade, letting it snap open with a click that seemed too loud in the mountain air. James surveyed the scene with practiced eyes. The young one was still by his bike, brass knuckles now on his right hand. The leader stood about 8 feet away, his size making him slower, but potentially dangerous if he got hold of someone. The bald one with the knife was the immediate threat, but his stance showed he was right-handed and favored his left leg, probably an old injury. 3 against 1, the leader sneered. "Not very fair odds for you, is it, soldier?" He was trying to scare James, unaware that these odds were nothing compared to what Special Forces operators regularly train for. James slid off his truck's hood, his movements smooth and controlled. He stood at his full height, and for the first time, the bikers seemed to realize just how big he was. At 6'2" and 220 pounds of trained muscle, James was an imposing figure. His t-shirt stretched across broad shoulders built by years of military training. "Fair odds?" James replied quietly. "You're right, it's not fair." He paused, looking each biker in the eye. "For you." Something in his voice made the young one take a step back. It wasn't a boast or a threat, it was just a simple statement of fact. The bald biker with the knife moved first, trying to circle around to James's left side. The leader stayed in front, his hands curled into meaty fists. They were trying to surround him, just like street thugs always did. But James had fought in conditions far worse than this. A cool mountain breeze swept through the overlook, rustling the trees. The sun was now barely visible above the horizon, painting everything in deep shadows. In the distance, a hawk cried out, as if sensing the coming violence. "Last warning," James said, his voice carrying the authority of someone used to being obeyed. "Get back on your bikes and leave. Nobody needs to get hurt here." His eyes never stopped moving, tracking each man's position, noting every shift in stance, every nervous twitch. The leader's face turned red with rage. Nobody talked to him like that, especially not some soldier on his turf. "Get him!" he roared, and the bald biker lunged forward with his knife, while the young one rushed in from the side, brass knuckles glinting in the fading light. James didn't move yet. His mind was clear, time seeming to slow down just like it did in combat. He could see their attack patterns, their weaknesses, their lack of coordination. In Afghanistan, he'd faced trained fighters with automatic weapons. These three were about to learn a harsh lesson about judging people by appearances. The peaceful mountain overlook was about to witness the difference between those who played at being tough and a man who had spent his life training for real combat. As the bikers charged in, James's muscles tensed, ready to show them exactly why they'd picked the wrong soldier to mess with. The bald biker's knife sliced through empty air where James had been standing just a split second before. In one fluid motion, James had shifted his weight and stepped to the side, moving like water around a rock. Years of combat training had made such movements second nature to him. The young biker with brass knuckles swung wildly from the right, but his attack was clumsy and telegraphed. James caught the man's wrist mid-swing, using the biker's own momentum against him. With a simple twist and pull, he sent the young man stumbling forward, crashing into his knife-wielding friend. "That's your first mistake," James said calmly, his voice steady despite the chaos. "Never rush in without proper coordination." He spoke like an instructor giving a lesson, which only enraged the bikers more. The leader charged forward like an angry bull, thinking his size would give him the advantage. James waited until the last possible moment before sidestepping again, this time adding a precise strike to the man's kidney as he passed. The big man's charge turned into a pained stumble. "Second mistake," James continued, moving constantly to avoid being surrounded. "Don't assume size equals skill." His eyes never stopped scanning, treating this like any other combat situation he'd faced in his military career. The bald biker had recovered and was now circling more cautiously, his knife held low. The young one had lost his brass knuckles in the fall and was backing away, his earlier confidence completely gone. Fear had replaced the cockiness in his eyes as he realized they weren't dealing with an ordinary soldier. "You're gonna regret this," the leader wheezed, still trying to catch his breath from the kidney shot. He pulled out his own knife, making the mistake of announcing his move with a loud threat. James shook his head slightly. "Third mistake. Never announce your intentions in a fight." As if to demonstrate, he suddenly moved forward, his hand snapping out in a precise strike that caught the bald biker's wrist. The knife clattered to the ground as the man's hand went numb from the precise nerve strike. The young biker tried to run back to his motorcycle, but James's voice stopped him. "Stay right there. Running into traffic in the dark would be your fourth mistake." His tone carried such authority that the young man froze in his tracks. The leader made one last desperate attempt, throwing a heavy punch toward James's head. James slipped the punch like a professional boxer, then countered with two lightning-fast strikes, one to the solar plexus and another to the inside of the knee. The big man went down hard, all his bravado replaced by groans of pain. "I've had enough of this," James said, his voice still calm but carrying an edge of finality. "You all are going to sit down, right here, right now." It wasn't a request. The authority in his voice, backed by the demonstration of his skills, left no room for argument. The bald biker, still shaking his numb hand, looked at his fallen leader and then at the young kid who was practically shaking. The fight had lasted less than a minute, and none of them had managed to land a single hit on the soldier. What are you? The young biker asked, his voice trembling. He'd never seen anyone move like that outside of movies. Special Forces, James replied simply, trained to handle much worse situations than three untrained bikers with attitude problems. He reached into his truck and pulled out his phone. Now, I'm calling the police. You're all going to wait quietly and tell them exactly what happened here. The setting sun cast long shadows across the overlook as the three bikers sat on the ground, thoroughly defeated. James stood guard, his posture relaxed but ready. In the distance, the sound of police sirens began to echo off the mountain walls. The leader, still holding his injured knee, looked up at James with a mix of pain and disbelief. "We thought you were just some random soldier," he muttered. "That was your final mistake," James replied, watching the first police car's lights appear on the mountain road. "Never judge someone's capabilities by a quick glance, especially not a Special Forces soldier who came here for some quiet time." Two police cars pulled into the overlook, their blue and red lights painting the scene in alternating colors. The first officer out was a veteran cop named Mike Thompson, who'd been patrolling these mountain roads for 15 years. Behind him, his younger partner Sarah Rodriguez emerged with her hand resting cautiously on her holster. They found an unusual scene. Three rough-looking bikers sitting quietly on the ground, while a muscular man in an army t-shirt stood calmly nearby, looking completely unruffled. Officer Thompson recognized the leader of the bikers immediately, Bill Big Bear Matthews, a troublemaker who'd been causing problems in the area for months. "Evening, officers," James said professionally, his military bearing evident. "Staff Sergeant James Cooper, U.S. Army Special Forces. I got 3 subjects detained after they attempted to assault me." His voice was clear and precise, the kind of professional report that police officers appreciated. Officer Rodriguez began taking notes while Thompson surveyed the scene. The younger biker had a growing bruise on his jaw. The bald one was still flexing his right hand trying to get feeling back, and Big Bear couldn't seem to straighten his left leg properly. "Want to tell me what happened here?" Thompson asked, though he had a pretty good idea. They'd been getting reports about the mountain raiders causing trouble at scenic spots for weeks. James gave his account efficiently, like giving a mission report. "I was here remembering a fallen comrade when these 3 arrived. They tried to intimidate me, then attacked with weapons, 2 knives and brass knuckles." He pointed to where the weapons lay on the ground, well away from the bikers. "I defended myself using minimal necessary force and detained them." Big Bear tried to protest from his sitting position. "He attacked us. We were just..." "Save it, Bill." Officer Thompson cut him off. "We got 2 witnesses in that minivan over there who recorded the whole thing on their phones." He pointed to a vehicle parked further down the overlook, where a middle-aged couple sat watching the scene. The young biker's face went pale. They recorded everything. His tough guy act had completely vanished, replaced by genuine worry. "Sure did," Rodriguez confirmed, walking back from talking to the witnesses. "Got a nice clear video of you 3 starting the fight and the sergeant here defending himself. Real professional work, by the way," she added, nodding respectfully to James. James simply nodded back. He'd already collected his photo of Mark from the truck and tucked it safely in his pocket. The whole incident had taken him away from his purpose for being here, but somehow he felt Mark would have appreciated the irony of the situation. Thompson began reading the bikers their rights while Rodriguez called for a 3rd patrol car. The witnesses, Tom and Mary Bennett from Ohio, came forward to give their statements. They'd been taking pictures of the sunset when the bikers arrived, and Mary had the presence of mind to record everything on her phone when she saw trouble brewing. "That was amazing," Tom said to James, keeping his voice low. "I'd never seen anyone handle 3 attackers so calmly. Are all soldiers trained like that?" James shook his head. "Special Forces training is a bit more intensive than standard military training," he explained modestly. "But we're all taught to handle ourselves professionally." As the 3rd patrol car arrived and the officers began loading up the bikers, Big Bear made one last attempt to salvage his pride. "This ain't over, soldier boy." Officer Thompson tightened the handcuffs slightly. Actually, Bill, it is over. Assault with weapons, plus you're on probation. You'll be lucky to see these mountain roads again before next summer. James watched as the police efficiently processed the scene, photographing the weapons and taking statements. The sun had almost completely set now, painting the sky in deep purples and blues. A few early stars were becoming visible above the mountain peaks. Officer Rodriguez approached him one last time. "We'll need you to come down to the station tomorrow to sign your formal statement, Sergeant Cooper. And thank you for showing restraint. Not everyone would have handled it so professionally." James nodded, knowing that his Special Forces training had helped him end this confrontation without serious injuries. As the police cars began leaving the Overlook, he realized that while this wasn't how he planned to spend his evening remembering Mark, his friend would have appreciated seeing these bullies learn their lesson the hard way. After the police cars disappeared down the winding mountain road, the Overlook returned to its peaceful state. James stood at the stone wall again, looking out at the darkening valley below. The tourist couple, Tom and Mary Bennett, approached him cautiously. "Would you like some coffee, Sergeant Cooper?" Mary asked, holding out a thermos from their minivan. "We were planning to watch the stars up here, and we packed extra." Her kind smile reminded James of his own mother back in Kansas. "Thank you, ma'am," James replied, accepting the offer. You could tell they wanted to talk, and after the evening's excitement, some friendly conversation might help return the place to its intended purpose, a spot for peaceful reflection. Tom set up 2 folding chairs from their van, offering one to James. "We've been traveling across the country since I retired last month," he explained. "Never expected to see something like this, though. You handled those men like, well, I've never seen anything like it." James sat down, feeling the evening's tension slowly leaving his muscles. "Special Forces training prepares us for much worse situations," he said modestly. "The goal is always to end conflicts quickly and with minimal harm." Mary pulled out her phone, showing James the video she'd recorded. "The police said this will help with pressing charges. Those men have been terrorizing visitors up here for months, according to the officers." The video showed the entire confrontation from a different angle. James watched himself move with the trained precision that had become second nature through years of military service. It was strange seeing himself in action. During the actual fight, everything had been pure instinct and training. "I was about to call the police as soon as those bikers showed up," Tom admitted. "But then I saw how you handled yourself. It was like watching someone defuse a bomb, so careful and controlled." James took a sip of the offered coffee, appreciating its warmth in the cooling mountain air. "In Special Forces, we learned that combat should always be the last resort. I gave them several chances to walk away." Mary nodded, wrapping her sweater tighter around her shoulders as the night air grew cooler. "We heard you trying to talk them down. It reminded me of my brother. He was a Marine. Always said that real soldiers don't go looking for fights." The conversation paused as they all watched the last colors of sunset fade from the sky. Stars were appearing now, bright and clear in the mountain air. James pulled out the photograph of him and Mark, looking at it in the dim light. "Is that why you were up here?" Tom asked gently, noticing the military uniforms in the photo. "Remembering a friend?" James nodded slowly. "My best friend, Mark Wilson. 5 years ago today in Afghanistan." He passed the photo to Tom and Mary, who looked at it respectfully. "We used to talk about visiting places like this when we got home. He never got the chance." Mary wiped a tear from her eye, handing the photo back carefully. "You would have been proud of how you handled yourself today," she said softly. "Protecting others from bullies. That's what soldiers do, isn't it?" Mark would have laughed about it. James smiled slightly, remembering his friend's sense of humor. "He always said I had a talent for finding trouble, even when I was trying to avoid it." Tom stood up, looking at the now star-filled sky. "Well, Sergeant, would you like to join us for a while? We brought sandwiches, and I've got a telescope in the van. Sometimes the best way to remember someone is under the stars they love too." James considered the offer, looking at Mark's photo one more time before carefully tucking it away. The evening hadn't gone as planned, but maybe that was okay. Mark had always told him to stay open to unexpected friendships. "I'd like that," James replied, helping Tom set up the telescope. As they worked, He realized that even this interrupted memorial had served its purpose, reminding him that life goes on, and that there are still good people worth protecting in this world. The next morning, James walked into the Mountain Valley Police Station wearing his formal military uniform. He just finished his morning training session at Fort Bragg and wanted to maintain a professional appearance for his official statement. Several officers nodded respectfully as he entered. Word had already spread about the incident at the Overlook. Officer Rodriguez was waiting at the front desk, a stack of papers ready. "Good morning, Sergeant Cooper," she said with a smile. "I see the stories were true about military punctuality." She led him to a small interview room where Officer Thompson was already waiting. "The video evidence is pretty clear," Thompson said, pulling out some forms. "But we need your official statement to make the charges stick. Those three have been causing trouble for months, but nobody's been willing to press charges before." James sat down, noticing a familiar face in one of the photos on Thompson's desk. "Is that Lieutenant Wilson?" he asked, surprised to see Mark's image in a police officer's family photo. Thompson's eyes widened. "You knew my brother-in-law." He picked up the photo, a family Christmas gathering from 6 years ago. "Mark was married to my sister Sarah before." His voice trailed off as he made the connection. "Wait, you're that James? The one he always wrote about in his letters?" "Yes, sir," James replied quietly. "I was with him that day in Afghanistan. Yesterday was the 5th anniversary." The room fell silent as both men realized the connection. Officer Rodriguez, sensing the moment, quietly stepped out. Thompson sat back, shaking his head in amazement. "Sarah told me how you wrote to her after it happened, explaining everything. She said your letter helped her find closure." He paused, collecting himself. "Mark always said you were the best soldier he'd ever served with." James felt his throat tighten. He'd written to Mark's widow but had kept his distance, not wanting to intrude on her grief. "Mark was a brother to me," he said simply. "Not a day goes by that I don't think about him." "That's why you were at the Overlook," Thompson realized. "Mark loved that spot. Used to take Sarah there when he was home on leave." He pulled out his phone, typed a quick message, then looked back at James. "Sarah's going to want to see you. She's never really connected with anyone who was there that day." As they completed the paperwork for the charges against the bikers, Thompson shared stories about Mark's childhood, tales James had never heard. In return, James told Thompson about the good times in Afghanistan, the jokes and friendship that helped them through the tough days. "The bikers will be going away for a while," Thompson said, finishing the last form. "Multiple assault charges, weapons violations, plus Big Bear violated his probation. You might have done this whole mountain community a favor." "Just did what I was trained to do," James replied modestly. "Mark would have done the same." He stood up, preparing to leave, but Thompson stopped him. "Wait a second," the officer said, making a quick phone call. A few minutes later, Sarah Wilson walked into the station. She was older than in the photo James carried, but her eyes still held the same kindness Mark had always talked about. "James Cooper," she said softly, tears in her eyes. After all these years, she stepped forward and hugged him tightly. "Mike told me what happened at the Overlook. Protecting others, that's exactly what Mark would have done." James returned the hug, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. He carried the memory of Mark's loss alone for so long, but here were people who shared that same love and loss. "Would you join us for dinner tonight?" Sarah asked. "I have so many questions, and the kids, they'd love to meet their Uncle Mark's best friend." Her voice held hope and healing. Looking at Mark's family, James realized that sometimes the most meaningful memorials aren't found in quiet moments alone, but in connecting with others who share our memories. "I'd be honored," he replied, knowing that Mark would be smiling down on this moment of unexpected reunion. 2 weeks after the incident at the Overlook, James pulled his truck into the same parking spot, but this time he wasn't alone. Tom and Mary Bennett had extended their road trip to attend today's gathering, their minivan parked nearby. Officer Thompson and his wife stood talking with Sarah Wilson, while her 2 children, Michael and Emma, played near the stone wall under the watchful eye of Officer Rodriguez. The autumn air was crisp and clear, perfect for what they had planned. James stepped out of his truck wearing his dress uniform, medals gleaming in the afternoon sun. In his hands, he carried a small bronze plaque that the local community had helped create. "Perfect spot," Thompson said, pointing to a section of the stone wall. The Park Service had already approved the memorial placement, thanks to some quick work by the local authorities. Mark always stood right here when he visited. Sarah's children, aged 10 and 12, came running over. They'd spent several evenings with James over the past 2 weeks, listening to stories about their father in Afghanistan. Through James's memories, they were finally getting to know the hero their dad had been. Uncle James, Emma called out. She'd started calling him that after their first dinner together. Can we help put up the plaque? Her brother Michael nodded eagerly beside her. Of course. James smiled, kneeling down to their level. Your dad would want you both to be part of this. He handed Michael the special drill they brought, while Emma carefully held the plaque. The bronze plate was simple but meaningful, in memory of Lieutenant Mark Wilson, soldier, hero, friend. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. This overlook stands as a reminder that courage and sacrifice light the way for others. As they worked to mount the plaque, Mary Bennett set up a small picnic on nearby tables. She and Tom had become regular visitors to the overlook, often bringing their telescope to share the mountain stars with other tourists. The incident with the bikers, rather than scaring people away, had brought the community together. The mountain raiders are finished, Thompson reported, helping to secure the plaque. Big Bear and his friends took a plea deal. They'll be serving time, and their little gang has fallen apart. Some good came from that day. Sarah touched the finished plaque gently, tracing her late husband's name. Mark would have loved this, she said softly. Not just the memorial, but how it's brought people together. That's what he fought for: community, friendship, protection of others. James stepped back, looking at their work. The plaque caught the sunlight perfectly, visible to anyone who stopped at the overlook, but not intrusive. Below in the valley, life went on. Cars moving along distant roads, people living their lives in peace, all possible because of sacrifices made by soldiers like Mark. Uncle James, Michael said, tugging at his sleeve. Dad made you promise to look after us, didn't he, in Afghanistan? The boy was sharp, just like his father had been. James knelt down again, looking both children in the eyes. He did, and I mean to keep that promise. He pulled out the photograph he always carried, him and Mark in Afghanistan, and handed it to them. This is yours now. I have other photos, and you should have this one. Emma hugged the photo to her chest, while Michael stood straighter, trying to match James's military bearing. Sarah wiped away tears, watching her children finally connecting with their father's memory through his best friend. The group gathered for Mary's picnic, sharing stories and laughter as the sun moved across the sky. Tourists stopped to read the new plaque, some leaving flowers, others simply standing in respectful silence. The overlook had become more than just a scenic stop. It was now a place of memory, honor, and unexpected friendships. As evening approached, James stood at the wall one last time, looking out at the familiar view. He felt Mark's presence stronger than ever, not in sadness now, but in the legacy of love and connection that had grown from that day 2 weeks ago. Sometimes, he realized, the best way to honor fallen brothers was to build new bonds with those they left behind. Rest easy, brother, he whispered to the setting sun. Your family is safe, your memory lives on, and your overlook will always remind people what true courage looks like.